everything! How could you betray me like this?
The moment my father took his last breath, the clock started ticking on my wife's greed. At the funeral, she executed her final devastating move that sought to achieve my total financial and emotional ruin. The reception hall of the funeral felt cold, a bittersweet reminder of my father's success. I raised my crystal glass, the clink of ice a stark, irreverent sound in the heavy silence. To Dad, I managed, my voice steady, but the words tasted like ash. He taught me everything. He taught me about trust, and he taught me to always know exactly who you're dealing with. I let that last sentence linger. I knew I was talking to the room, but the chilling truth was I was talking directly to my wife, Sarah. I didn't need to look. I could feel her presence, a cold, calculated heat, standing near the marble fireplace, the small silver-leafed envelope clutched in her hand like a small, exquisite bomb. I finished the toast, lowered the glass, and stepped off the riser. The ordeal was almost over, I thought. Sarah moved instantly. With the predatory grace of a great cat, she intercepted me near the mahogany bar, efficiently blocking me from the family attorney, Mr. Thompson, and the accountant. "I am so sorry, Mark," she whispered, her voice a low, throaty rasp, meant only for me. Sorry? She didn't sound sorry about Dad. She sounded sorry about what she was about to do. She pressed the envelope into my hand. It was thick, stiff linen, far too substantial for a simple note. I knew what it was. I'd been waiting for this moment since Dad's fatal heart attack 6 weeks ago, when her subtle inquiries about his digital security immediately sharpened into something more rapacious. I turned my back to the room, pretending to dab at my eyes. My thumb broke the seal. Inside, the petition for dissolution of marriage, a request for an immediate total freeze on all our joint assets, and a temporary restraining order based on vague, yet professionally articulated concerns for personal safety. She was attempting a scorched earth strategy designed to cripple me emotionally and financially while I was at my weakest. This was a well-calculated hostile takeover. I looked up from the stark black print. I looked at Sarah. She was waiting for the shock, the anger and tears. She was waiting for me to shatter into the grieving, defenseless widower she thought she had married. But the shattering never came. My face went white, yes, but it wasn't actually from shock. It was the white-hot flash of vindication. She actually did it. She went through with the plan just as Dad and I had predicted she would. This was phase 1 of a contingency plan hatched across late nights in Dad's private study, using the very files she tried to steal. Although I wasn't experiencing a tragic betrayal, I was also confirming the successful activation of a trap. I refolded the papers with care and slipped it deep into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. Sarah's timing, serving the papers here, now, before the reading of the will, was flawless in its cruelty.
But she only saw the first step. I was 10 steps ahead, and the next move, the one that would destroy her not just emotionally, but financially, publicly, and permanently, was seconds away from being deployed. I took 3 deep breaths and walked toward the antique mahogany desk. Every muscle in my body felt tight. I'd lived with Sarah for 7 years, and I thought I knew her capacity for ambition. But over the last 2, I'd learned that beneath the veneer of the supportive, sophisticated wife was a financier with a single massive target: my father's money. Dad had built his tech company, Aegis Innovations, from a garage startup into a multi-billion-dollar fortress. He was the sole trustee, managing the vast fortune with an iron fist. Sarah wasn't interested in the lifestyle. She already had that. She was interested in the control of the principal. Her plan was elegant in its brutality. She believed I would inherit total, unrestricted control of the trust and the company upon Dad's death. Her strategy was to strike immediately, blindside me with the divorce papers before the will was read, while I was shattered and grieving. By immediately freezing the joint assets, she'd starve me of liquid cash and force me into a disastrous settlement where she'd claim a massive share of the marital estate, which she would argue included a significant future claim on the trust's assets. Once the divorce was settled, she planned to use that financial leverage and perhaps the humiliation of the restraining order to help me manage the remainder, eventually pressuring me to dissolve the trust and liquidate the fortune for easier access. The first crack in the facade appeared 6 months ago. I'd walked into Dad's study late one evening, only to find Sarah sitting at his private terminal, hands poised over the keyboard. She'd claimed she was looking for a phone charger. Dad's terminal was encrypted with 6 layers of security and required biometric access. I confronted him later that night. He didn't react with anger, but with profound disappointment. "She's calculating the yield, Mark," he said, his voice grave. "She doesn't see any of this as legacy. She sees a piggy bank that needs smashing." We discovered she hadn't just tried to access the funds. She'd hired a forensic accountant and compiled a detailed list of every asset held by the trust, right down to the offshore holdings. That was the night the game changed. That was the night we stopped being father and son planning a succession and started being 2 generals preparing a final, intricate defense. Dad and I spent his final weeks discussing palliative care and structuring an impenetrable financial fortress. We knew the moment she heard the phrase, Richard L. Markson Family Trust, she would move. And we knew her most powerful weapon would be the element of surprise, the funeral ambush. So we crafted the codicil. We changed the core structure of the inheritance, transforming the private trust into a public, irrevocable legacy foundation. This foundation would require a single key contingency to activate and seal it forever from marital claim. We needed a trigger that only Sarah could pull. My father, who preempted Sarah way better than I did, laid out the final terms. I would be named chairman with a substantial salary, but the principal assets, the multi-billion-dollar fortune, would be protected and untouchable, provided I met one key condition. I had to be unmarried when the will was read.
If I were divorced before the will was read, the foundation would activate immediately. If I remained married, the distribution would be delayed for years, placing the assets into escrow, where she could argue her claim through endless litigation. She couldn't touch the fortune if I were single the moment the documents were processed. The only way for me to fulfill this requirement instantly, guaranteeing the foundation's immediate unbreakable status, was for Sarah herself to file the papers before the reading. I glanced toward the antique mahogany desk. Mr. Thompson, Dad's stoic old-school attorney, was standing next to it. He knew everything. He was the second silent piece of the trap. I reached the desk and nodded to Mr. Thompson, whose face was impassive. I ignored the subtle, venomous stare I knew Sarah was directing at my back. "It's done," I whispered into his ear, my voice low and devoid of emotion. "The papers are served. Confirm the activation sequence." Mr. Thompson replied in his precise, dry tone. "The Foundation's documents are notarized, dated, and ready for immediate public activation. The trust is now fully protected and irrevocable. Proceed with the reading." "Understood," I said, and walked away slowly. That simple conversation had ratified the end of my marriage and secured my father's legacy. It was the coldest, most businesslike transaction of my life. When I moved back to where the guests were gathered, everyone noticed the shift. The grief-stricken, hollowed-out sun was gone. I moved with a serene, focused intensity that cut through the polite murmurings. My eyes found Sarah. She was leaning against a shelf, watching me with a look of subtle, premature triumph. She thought I was reeling. Perhaps I was rushing off to call my own attorney in a panic. I took a stand right where I stood to take the eulogy. "I want to thank you all for coming," I announced. My gaze swept the room, making eye contact with every major player. The family, the senior executives, and finally, Sarah. Before we all depart, there's one last legal detail my father Richard insisted on finalizing at this very gathering. The silence in the room was absolute, as I reached into the inner pocket of my coat and pulled out a document, a very official-looking, thick-rolled parchment tied to the velvet ribbon. Every eye was fixed on the parchment. I unrolled it with a sharp flick of my wrist. I cleared my throat and began to read, my voice steady and professional. This is the last will and testament of Richard L. Markson, dated 3 weeks prior to his passing. I skipped the boilerplate formalities and went straight to the core distribution clause, the one Sarah had been banking on. She was leaning forward, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. She thought I was reeling. Perhaps I was rushing off to call my own attorney in a panic. A sanded change occurred in Sarah as I read my father's legacy. When I put down the parchment and raised my eyes, I was met by a look of utter terror. In her eyes, I saw the cold realization of what she had lost. Not just the share of the fortune, but the influence and control she had coveted. The end of her plans lay bare before her. The shift in the room was palpable, and started when I said the term unconditional and the phrase fully protected under the foundation. She couldn't fight an immunity she had known was there. Instead, her insidious plan was for me to just be too devastated to activate the foundation and try to persecute her on a more personal level. When I said the word activation, she realized I was acting with extreme professionalism and solid structure. That was her undoing. I met her gaze briefly and gave her nothing. I allowed her to savor that moment of victory for exactly 5 seconds. Then I continued, the words landing like a heavy, cold hammer blow. However, as Mark and I discussed at length, I knew his recent marriage was built on a shaky foundation. Sarah's triumphant smirk dissolved instantly. Her eyes narrowed, searching my face for the hidden clause, the trap she hadn't anticipated. The murmurs in the room started again, louder now and tinged with scandal. Therefore, to protect my legacy, I have included a crucial codicil to the trust, effective immediately. The trust's entirety and all related assets, including all shares of Aegis Innovations, will be immediately and permanently placed into the Richard and Mark Markson Irrevocable Legacy Foundation. I saw Sarah's financial mind scramble. Irrevocable Foundation. That term was a massive, concrete wall between her and the money. Mark will serve as chairman of the foundation, with a generous annual salary reflective of his duties, but with no personal access or ownership of the principal unless he is unmarried and remained so for a period of 5 years from the date of this reading. The room erupted. Gasps, confused whispers, outright shock. The senior executives exchanged panicked glances, but I heard none of it. I was watching Sarah. She was no longer concerned about propriety or grief. She was cornered. Her face was a terrifying picture of sudden, naked greed and devastating realization. Her entire calculated strategy, the ambush, the timing, the legal maneuvering, was designed around my owning the money first. But if the foundation was triggered, if I were officially unmarried, the billions vanished into a structure that legally protected them from any marital claim, past or present. I reached into my breast pocket and slowly, deliberately, pulled out the thick, silver-leafed envelope she had given me. I held it up for the room to see. "As you can see," I said, "this divorce filing served moments ago by my wife, Sarah, at my father's funeral, confirms that as of this very moment, I am officially and legally unmarried." Sarah, I looked directly at her, across the shocked faces of the mourners. "You thought you were serving me with the papers to take half of this estate. You were only serving me with the key to fulfill my father's codicil. You activated the foundation and locked yourself out of every dime in the trust, permanently. You played your hand too early, and you handed me the legal leverage to protect everything Dad and I ever built." Her face was white, the emerald eyes burning with a hatred that finally stripped away every last pretense of sympathy. She had not only lost lots of money, but had also been used as the final instrument in securing the money against herself. I took a breath, letting the full weight of the revelation settle over her horrified face. "The only thing you are now entitled to is your share of the joint marital home and the checking account, as I am currently unmarried, thanks to you. You didn't only give me the divorce, Sarah, you gave me the key to the vault you no longer open." I held her in my gaze, allowing the full, terrible weight of her mistake to settle. I gently placed her official divorce papers down, resting them squarely on top of the open, embossed last will and testament. I straightened up, taking a small, satisfied breath. The room remained silent, but the shock had morphed into a stunned realization of the sheer magnitude of her failure. Sarah's plan for billion-dollar wealth had culminated in a very modest settlement, handed to her by the very documents she'd wielded as a weapon of ultimate cruelty. Sarah stood paralyzed by the bar. Her lips were parted, but no sound came out. The billions she had calculated and waited 7 years for had just evaporated, whisked away by the very weapon she deployed. I watched her face, searching for a flicker of humanity, of regret for the years, for the man she pretended to love. There was none, only pure, devastating financial rage. I stepped away from the desk and walked directly toward Sarah, cutting a path through the frozen guests. Every eye in the room followed my movement. I stopped a foot away from her. She finally found her voice, a dry, brittle sound, barely above a whisper. You knew, she hissed. You watched me. You let me do this to myself. Did you think my father and I were fools? I asked. You were caught logging into his terminal. Did you truly believe your desperation wasn't obvious? Her hand clenched into a white-knuckled fist. It was mine. I put in the time, the appearances. I earned my right to that fortune. No, Sarah. You earned a percentage of our marital assets, I corrected, glancing pointedly at the envelope she had delivered. And thanks to your own precise timing, that's exactly what you got. You valued the whole fortune over our marriage, and because you gambled for everything, you lost the only significant thing you were actually entitled to. I leaned in, ensuring my next words were a memory she could never scrub clean. You assumed that I would be devastated by your betrayal. You were right, but you failed to consider that my father, the great Richard Markson, was a man who always built a countermeasure for every threat he faced. You, my dear, were the threat. Sarah didn't argue further. She simply recoiled, her entire body shaking with impotent fury. The sight of me standing calm and solvent while she faced financial ruin was more than she could bear. All she could do was flee the scene with a soundless gasp. She spun on her heel and pushed past the nearest stunned guests. She was the one who had planned the dramatic, public exit for me, yet she was the one reduced to a desperate flight, disappearing through the heavy oak doors. I watched the doors swing shut, the tension in the room released in a collective, confused exhale. I returned to the desk, picked up the divorce papers, and without a glance at them, crumpled the expensive linen into a tight ball. My grief for my father remained, but now it was fortified by the quiet, fierce pride that we had won his final battle together.